Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to ETCFO, a dedicated news portal by the Economic Times, which covers the CFO community and talks about the finance and India Inc. and the economy as a whole. This is our second series, which is a special series on the budget. And in this live series, you can obviously log on to all the social media platforms of ETCFO, whether it's LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and you can see us live. You can also ask us questions specifically related to budget. And I'm glad to share with you that we have very interesting panelists here. In fact, I must say a stellar panelist because we have a different aspects going to be covered. Somebody from market, somebody from economy, somebody from retail, and also the logistics segment. So we are going to discuss a lot. But before that, I will specifically tell you that this is a budget series, and last week was the first week where we brought a lot of CFOs together and discussed their expectations on the budget. In today's situation, specifically, there are 2-3 important trends, specifically about inflation. Interest rate are very, very high, and it's still not under control, which is a worry for the government and the policy holders, central banks as well. On the other side, government may try to do something better this time because this is the last budget before the election. So hopes are really high, and all the eyes are also there on the budget. So let's discuss from the CFOs and the economists in terms of what is it that they expect from the government on the 1st February when the Nirmala Sitharaman finance minister will unveil the budget. So let me introduce you to my panelist first. My first panelist for this particular discussion is Mr. Anand Agrawal, the CFO of V-Mart Retail. Anand, glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Amol. Glad to be here.
My next speaker is Mr. Kunal Sanghvi, CFO of HDFC Securities. Kunal, glad to have you.
Yeah, same here. Glad to be here.
Thank you. My next speaker is Madhavi Arora, Lead Economist, Emkay Global Financial Services. Madhavi, glad to have you.
Hi, guys.
And my last speaker for this panel is Mr. Anil Gambhir, CFO of Blue Dart. Anil, glad to have you.
Hi. Being here. Good afternoon to you all.
Sure, thank you. So thank you so much for joining. And let me shoot a very basic question to all of you. And I will start with you, Anand, and then we'll go with the rest. What are your expectations from the union budget?
Amol, I think I don't think it is going to be a populist budget going by what we have seen from the government in the past, and this is the second term that the government is currently undergoing. And even in the last full budget that they had presented before the election year in their first term, it was not a very populist budget. So my expectation really is it is not going to be a very populist budget, despite the fact that this is going to be the last full budget before the elections get due in May of 24. My sense is that, the budget should be around 3 or 4 themes. I think the primary theme should be around driving consumption. Because there are 2 aspects which are very much, hovering on almost everybody's mind. And I'm sure the other panelists will also like to contribute here. But one is around driving consumption. We've seen a global slowdown, which has, started since the last 1 year almost. And going forward, also, there is a lot of talk which is happening around, a recession which is looming ahead. Now, from both the counts, one from the global aspect and second also from the India-specific concept, I think it will be very pertinent for the government to take initiatives to drive more and more consumption, because that is, in any case, India in any case always has been a domestic consumption economy. and driving more consumption will lead to more income getting created, more spends getting accrued, and therefore drive in the GDP as well. I think the second theme that I expect from this budget should be around simplification. Simplification around income taxes, simplification around GST, simplification around ease of doing business, and that we've always been talking, more and more about reforms, whether it is land reforms or labor reforms, but simplification around various processes that only budgets can deliver. And third, I think would be around promoting growth in identified areas, and by identified areas I mean probably around climate sensitive areas, probably around startups, around consumption driving companies or sectors, and even export promotion sectors, because we also realize that while the Indian rupee has been going down against the dollar, but it has been appreciating against the pound and the yen and the euro. So sector specific or geography specific incentives or initiatives that the budget can drive will help deliver much better prospects for India Inc. So that's in broad what my expectations from this budget are.
Sure, Anand. I think quite meaningful thoughts here. Like the chronology. Let me move my focus to Anil.
Yeah, Amol, thanks for having me here. I think if you see last two, three budgets, as Anand rightly mentioned, there is some amount of theme government has been propagating. And my view is slightly different on the theme. I think the government has been focusing more on infrastructure building. I think the focus would continue to be investing more in infrastructure, because the moment you improve infrastructure, there's always 3x, 4x, increase in capex from private sectors, which takes up the growth further. So focus on infrastructure would continue, so that which will be the base on which, like in Make in India or China Plus One, which you talk about, manufacturing sector will also continue to have have some favor for the government, and maybe more sectors could be added in the PLI scheme, so that that further boosts the manufacturing sector, which will create not only the growth in the economy, but also will create employment. Having said that, the common factor which will continue to be there is the digitalization. So, like if we have seen in national logistic policies, the government has put in a digital platform for various governments to collaborate and take faster decision. So my understanding is, or rather, I would say that similar kind of metrics could be prepared for each state, and what we are talking about is ease of doing business. I think those could be ranked on that metrics, that which is the best state which offers ease of doing better. But in the competitive scenario, people would work and try and attract more investment, which will lead to higher growth for the country. Of course, the basic thing on skill development and also education and focus on agriculture would continue to be there, which has been the core theme. Yes, for some time, probably defense has not been spoken as much as earlier it was spoken. And given the current geopolitical situation and the kind of events were there in China, there could be enhanced, allocation to defense as well, or further improvement in the defense production in within the country. That could be another thing. So over to you.
Okay, sure, Anil. I think again meaningful thoughts here from both of you. Let me get some perspective on the economy side. And Madhavi, I would like to hear you now.
Yeah, so I think for this year, the government doesn't have much room for experimentation as much as far as consolidation is concerned. Clearly, after being, after 3 years of being driven by the pandemic and the conflict management that they had to do with regard to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, um, the next leg of FY24 budget has to be probably more budget balancing to show that we are back to the business of fiscal prudence while also supporting growth. That conflict between growth management, fiscal management is going to be continuing. What we saw last year is that despite the fact that we had seen a huge surge in subsidies because of the Ukraine conflict, it was offset by a materially high collection, which sort of led to a general improvement in the fiscal backdrop. So we are starting the year with, a a fiscal state which is relatively well managed as far as the budget expectations were concerned. There's not much going to be any slippage on that front, and government also has now been steadily but slowly removing the pandemic related emergency measures, which also should ideally add to the fiscal sustainability over the medium term. So I think the first and foremost thing that they need to work out for would be, how to ensure that the fiscal consolidation continues without hurting growth too much, because we are going to be sitting in a situation where you will have a hard choice of patchy unequal growth momentum, especially as a global slowdown slash recession takes place, and how they continue to ensure that there is a no problem of sustainable debt, because we are sitting with almost 95% of debt to GDP ratio of sovereign sector, which is center plus state, and how the consolidation of that really happens over the medium term. So I think to that extent it becomes very important how the budget maximizes the fiscal impulse that they have by focusing on expenditure on both demand side management as well as domestic production, because that will also improve your productive capacity, which also will ensure that the potential growth picks up in the medium term. So that I think to that extent budget would be watched out for, one, the pace of fiscal consolidation, which I think will continue to at least to the tune of 0.5% of GDP from 6.4 in FY23, how the policymakers prioritize the spending ahead um, in terms of revex and capex, given that it's a election budget, where there could be a relatively higher allocation in agri and rural, as well as farmer development sector, plus how they intend to or how they plan to fund their fiscal deficit, because in the end, even with a 5.8 to 5.9% fiscal deficit next year, the borrowing of the government is going to be substantially high, over close to around 15.2 trillion on an average, which will be a difficult task for them to fund, as you go ahead in next year. And fourth, of course, how they deliver on their strategy to revert to a more medium-term debt sustainability path, because as I said, we're sitting with around 94% debt to GDP ratio from sovereign's end, and in the end, you have only one way to go, which is consolidation. And doing that, how they still intend or aim to increase the growth potential over the next few years or so. I think these 4 5 points is something that on a broad basis policymakers would be discussing or working on when they're coming out with the numbers on the 1st of Feb.
Uh, Very realistic and quite a meaningful data points, Madhvi. I think when we speak about the expenditure and when we expect a lot from the government, we should also see how much is there in their pocket, right? Before we expect them to spend. Valuable thoughts here, Madhvi. Let me come to you, Kunal, and take your perspective here now.
I think so. We have come up with a stage which is kind of globally much more in a different situation, and India is in a different situation as we all are experiencing. So from here on, let us first understand that whatever strategies and policies have been there has really worked well till now. And as we saw last year in budget, it was way more on an ongoing basis rather than too much of measures here and there. I see some populist measures maybe kicking in this time. So that's the one thing which kind of looks very obvious. Having said that, there are a lot of constructive measures that will continue, be it on the EV side or be it on the capex and manufacturing side. I would be wanting to see continued investment in capex and infra, which is going to be very important this year, because as we all saw, that has something that has really been a very strong cycle in the overall economy moving. I also believe that there has been a splurge in interest rate in last maybe say few months, and more importantly say around 9 months or so. We have seen a good sharp 150 200 basis point rise, and that is going to hurt the corporates in India for sure. And with the plans of government that are there to have manufacturing also getting very strong over a period of time, the interest rates will have to come down for the growth of India. And interest rates is very important, but that's not going to be easy for sure as well, given the fact that global has been very in an inflationary mode, and inflation even in India is going to be on the higher side, while we are relatively way more managed as compared to other global economies. So having said that, I think so boosting consumption So more measures which will help boost consumption. Continued capex is something that is second that I see strongly. Few populist measures, if not more, and definitely continued in the emerging sectors like EV and manufacturing boost as well is something I see. If you ask from a financial services perspective, I believe GST has been on the higher side, and government is seeing very robust collections out there as well, and maybe some amount of relief over there will help the overall economy as well.
Okay, I think with the first round, I got enough meat from all of you. I think quite a meaningful thoughts here. Let me get into little specifics, and Anand, I will come back to you. You mentioned about the consumption, which is obviously a very important factor. But if I ask specifically for your industry, which is again a very very critical industry, and export import matters a lot in this particular segment. So, what is it that specifically that you think that the government should do for your sector in terms of ease of doing business, in terms of making simplification, and in terms of strengthening this particular segment?
So, Amol, I think it's a full menu actually, because if I look at retail, and retail is actually linked to the extreme grassroots level. And what is the challenge that we have seen in the last at least 1 year, if not more, definitely has been that the income levels have remained where they are, while the inflation has taken away a lot of disposable income that a lot of customers have or had. Now, obviously, if the government spend goes up, whether in the form of Manrega, whether in the form of NREGS, or capex spend or infra spend, all of that definitely flows into the disposable income that the common people have, and that effectively drives consumption, and that effectively drives retail and other forms of growth. So even the GST collections indirectly get impacted, because you are driving more consumption, people are buying more, and therefore the government is able to collect more taxes, and it's a cycle. Now, the problem for the industry is not only consumption. I think the problems are, multifaceted, and consumption definitely is going to solve the major chunk of the problem, not only for the retail sector, but I think for a lot of other sectors as well. But coming back to retail, I think there's been a very sharp increase in cotton yarn prices over the last 2 years, and one specific relief that the sector can look up to is to allow more duty-free imports of cotton yarn into the country, because the domestic prices have gone up by almost 78%, despite they have come down by 40% in the last 6 months. Despite of that, from a pre-COVID level, they are up by 78%, and that is definitely driving more and more hardship for the sector in general. The other relief, obviously, also that we have been talking about is the announcement of a national retail policy. Retail being a very small, very, very large sector, but has been devoid of a national retail, national policy for many, many years. And that is something that has to co-join with the e-commerce policy. Now, e-commerce, there has been working drafts released for a lot of various, aspects, but still there is a lot of clarity which still, needs to get rolled out. And that, along with the national retail policy, should pave the way for a more streamlined, structured growth. As we all might be aware that organized retail in India still accounts for less than 10% of the overall retail. Now, if we have to increase that from 10% to 20 or 30 or 40, like in US, it is almost like 80-90%. Now, if we have to reach to those levels of consumption drivers, I think there is a far more organized framework that the legislature needs to provide, so that that can be a more inclusive growth. So I think. Apart from this, there is one more very related aspect which concerns retail in particular, which is the logistics part. So a freight corridor and a more ease of transportation, especially around rural areas, which will again drive infra spend, as Anil mentioned. So more investments in road, more investments in corridors, or more investments in freight handling capabilities will allow not just the retail sector, but I think at an overall level economy, for the economy to grow even at a much faster pace.
Detailed one, Anand, and a really important one. I think absolutely critical points that you mentioned here. And you kind of gave a hint for Anil also to continue the discussion. So Anil, you already mentioned about the infrastructure, but if you want to add more in terms of one, obviously how important and what kind of changes and the policies that the government should have specifically in this budget for infrastructure, and what kind of development they should consider. But more importantly, lots of projects have already been announced from Sagar Mala to Bharat Mala to Freight Corridor. Do you by any chance think that the government should focus more on completing and completing these product projects than announcing many more?
To cover the sector, I was talking about the same thing. While we have been investing in doing infrastructure, what matters is the speed. No, speed. If you look at a dedicated freight corridor, or on through railways or for road, I think many of the projects have been taking away a lot of time. So that way, obviously, one that it delays the intended result, but at the same time, project cost goes up, and then as a result, recoveries go up, and by the time project is completed, capacity is already consumed. We are always short of the infrastructure. So I think when you talk about all this infrastructure, government has taken note of it, and in fact, National Logistic Policy and PM Gati Shakti program are supposed to be addressing that aspect of delay, whereby the project gets monitored and timely get completed, and also they work in a collaborative manner so that new project when they design, that takes care of all the requirements of other departments as well. So, having said that, I think intent has been very good from government side to show that speed, but the ground reality speed has to come on the ground. That is what probably we would expect that to happen. So we have seen recently. I was reading an article where our surface ground minister has been talking about that by 2024 there will be new 28 new highways would be done, and there's a good speed of road being constructed. While that is welcome move, at the same time other mode of travel, be it train or be it waterways which are being spoken about, or even air all of these, if that those can be expedited in a timely manner, that could address a lot of issues which Anand talked about. So one specific thing let me highlight here. Government has been recognizing that logistic cost being higher. The 13-14% target is to bring to single digit, high single digit kind of this thing. I think there are quite a few enabler which are there. One, obviously, the infrastructure. Second, under logistic policy, when things needs to be now brought further, whereby it enables the business, be it investment in logistic parks, be it vehicles availability or financing availability to the or formalization of economy through borrowing through banking system. All of that will lead to efficiency. And another big part, which probably is GST, which was another enabler. I think on the GST side, now things have started stabilizing. But one of the area where government was looking at that central distribution or distribution through the warehouse, which will lead to high efficiency. Probably that is still not happen. And
Right.
for that probably you can say one that there have been a lot of back and forth in the GST provisions, and two, even the positions which people have taken, that is still not settled. When I say not settled, that assessment for the first and second year are yet are not completed. So people are not still sure that whether the positions they have taken basis their own interpretation, whether those will hold good. So that is the impediment for any of the company to change the supply chain and derive benefit of central distribution and have better efficiency by using digital technology, or ensuring that they work 24 by 7 from a one or maybe a maximum four warehouses. All that again indicating towards speed. I think speed in everything matters a lot. Be it bringing efficiency, be it ensuring that infrastructure is available for faster development. All that would require speed from the government side.
I think I'll just add to what Anil said. Amol, I fully endorse the point that announcement of more projects is not the key. It's more about completing the already announced projects. There's
Yes.
so much of unspent fund both at the center as well as at the state level. I think if the government could only just make sure that all of that fund and the announced projects are completed well in time, I think we may still postpone the budget by another 2 years.
Sure, quite meaningful. In fact, on a softer note, Mumbaikars are dying to see the second line of metro since ages now because everywhere the construction is going on. So, thanks for the rejoinder, Anand, and really minor details, Anil. Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, friends, those who are watching this particular show, if you have any particular question, please do shoot your question on any social media platform. Please stick to only budget. That's the question. I will try my best to take it with the speakers here. So, Madhavi, let me come back to you. And you partly mentioned, and which is actually the noble truth, that the government doesn't have enough or maybe deep pockets to spend this time, and even the debt to GDP ratio is also very high. So and apart from this, there is a fear of recession also. But ultimately, they have to make people happy. Ultimately, they have to make industries happy. So, what do you think should be government's priority now? Should the tame subsidies? Should they, don't spend extra funds or something like that? Maybe if you could give us some key factors that you think that the government should do this time.
So, see, as most of you guys are discussing, I think the one key factor that everybody is going to watch for is that there's going to be a growth pressure, because at this point in time, we're not necessarily looking at any big growth lever or a economic agent which is going to drive the next leg of economy, right? I mean, last year it was exports, and of course, a part of the public capex spending, which sort of helped the growth story. And of course, because of the post-pandemic pent-up demand release that we saw, there was a consumption push as well. The hope is that this time around, given the kind of clean balance sheets that we had for the corporates, and especially the large corporates who are sitting with huge savings in hand, would reinvest their proceeds, because you are also looking at a very tight capacity constraints. But all of this still hasn't given people conviction that we're looking at a next leg of capex push on the private sector side. And all these while, what you had seen is that the government has been largely driving the capex leg, and unfortunately they are still a marginal player in the capex story in India. Of the almost 31% investment GDP ratio, public sector, which is center plus states plus PSUs, is not more than 6.7, 6.8% of GDP. That means the rest has to be driven by large corporates, MSME, and households in general, as far as the private capex is concerned. So the hope was that the government spending would lead to some kind of a crowding in, which clearly hasn't happened. And why so? Because to my understanding, the private capex cycle is essentially very endogenous to the private consumption story. And since 2018, what you've seen is a general slower income growth, especially in the rural sector, which also was the case in urban and very recently. And since there was no visible secular demand from the consumption side, there was no reason for you to really put up a plant and go in for a very Gangu India growth story, which is led by consumption. So I think that still remains to be a big issue for us at this point in time. The rural incomes still are lingering. You may talk about a cyclical recovery in rural because of better harvest, or probably like we heard in last year when the Ukraine war happened, the agri prices have gone up and everybody was very gung-ho about the terms of trade going positive for the sector in general. But rural sector is now largely driven by non-agriculture than agriculture sector. I think agriculture is not more than 25% of the total NDP, or net domestic product, of rural sector, which means that almost 75% of the rural economy is driven by non-agriculture sector. So I think that to that extent, if the government is looking to improve the consumption pattern of the economy, which is probably needing more help on the rural side, this I think the spend should be more on rural development rather than agri and farm welfare, although both of them need some support from the governments. And in fact, last 3 years we've actually seen agriculture, farm welfare, and overall rural welfare or development spending coming off as a percent of GDP. I'm not talking in absolute terms or year-on-year terms, but as a percent of GDP, that actually it has come off. And my sense is that remainder of this year, there will be a higher rural allocation than what they even promised in budget. And next year also, the rural development allocation is going to be higher. I think they've realized that, especially going into an election year, and the fact that we are still looking at the K-shaped recovery play out in a very asymmetric fashion. I think it makes sense for the policymakers to ensure that there's some sort of a rebalancing that happens in the economy, of which rural plays a very important part. And of course, that would itself lead to a second order impact for private capex when they see a more sustainable consumption story play out. That said, I don't think the center is going to give up its focus on capital expenditure. My only fear is how the states and the public sector units, would contribute, because what has happened in the last few years is that center has taken on the baton of the state. State used to be a large player in the public sector as far as uh, the capex spend was concerned. Last 3 years, center has actually increased its allocation from barely 1.8, 1.9% of GDP to now close to 2.8% plus of GDP. And the delta loss has been actually borne by public sector units and the state governments. So on net, the public overall, the public expenditure actually has come off in FY23 and probably will be the case in FY24. So while we talk about the government spending in general on infra push and capex, overall the public sector actually has been falling as a percent of GDP. So I think to that extent, it will be important to watch, how much of that contribution really plays out. One, and two, what the government does in terms of the consumption and rural segment of the economy to be able to increase, overall consumption dynamics in the ecosystem that we are living in at this point in time.
Noted your points. Very well said. In fact, uh, yeah, that's the indicator. In fact, so Kunal, let me come to you and drag this conversation on the private capex cycle part. What is it that you think government should do specifically to improve or the boost or strengthen the private capex cycle? Because though we are kind of vouching and singing balance for the credit growth story of Indian bank, capex cycle is still not as remarkable as it should have been. And if it's not happening now, it's fine because at least the rates have gone up, but it didn't even pick up when the interest rates were really really low, and that time also the corporates didn't think much about it. So what is in your view? I mean, at one side you see the market is fluctuating and perhaps showing great signs, specifically for India at least. But on the other side, the worry of the private cycle is private cycle investments or the capex cycle is really high. So what is your view there? Is there any scope that the finance minister have to improve this?
I think so. Budget can do a lot around it, and as Vantri was telling rightly, a lot of focus will continue to be there in the capex. And having said that, what will happen in private capex, I believe, is there can be some amount of incentivization plan, but I think so that's a high wish to have it from a budget angle perspective. What I would essentially wish is that a continued focus on incentivizing large manufacturing setups, which essentially attracts a lot of capex and public-private partnerships. These are the two things that will continue to kind of be robust. At the same time, leaving a little more disposable income with the corporates, which is also the continued government plan of reducing the corporate tax rate, will also help to boost the overall momentum and the sentiment as well, which will try and help to increase this thing. Going sector by sector is also going to be very important. There will be sectors which actually need focus, they are in the need of capex, etc., and which need a push from a private perspective. So, creating specific schemes and maybe say, like we have a lot of PLI schemes as well, we can have more around it. We can go region by region, that is also going to be very important, and then trying to look at areas which required in general momentum like digitization technology. I still believe that from a government side and even from India private side, a lot of investments needs to be attracted there, not only from a short-term perspective but from a very long-term perspective. So those are the some of the kind of investments. While the physical infra government is spending a lot, there is a lot of virtual and digital infra also that will require a lot of things, where I believe private is making some kind of decent investments. And then we have telecom sector as well, wherein also government is proactively taking a lot of focus. So that is also kind of taking up well over a period of time. But at the same time, it requires a larger push. So those are the areas, and I believe that it is required. There are initiatives, but a lot more can be done on the private side as well. A corporate tax rate reduction is something that probably I see as a continued measure, maybe a small, but that is something as a long-term initiative that government has been planning, is something we will continue to wish for, which will also help to boost the equity sentiments as well because of the larger corporate profitabilities.
So you want only reduction in corporate taxation, not on the individual side.
I think so. What will happen is, as you can already evidently see, there are areas wherein corporates are ending up paying lower, but individuals are paying higher. And as we all know, what we are paying sometimes is actually going much larger than probably what is the corporate outgo. But somehow, if you look from an overall economy perspective, that's working. So I don't want to fiddle that equation. While my personal wish would have definitely been to what Amol you said, but I think so. Let's look at also what's working.
Right. Sure. So let me take one individual question to you, Anil and Anand, first, specifically about your company. Given the current situation where we are talking about the capex cycle, the corporates are not going very aggressively, the interest rates are high, and the geopolitical tensions will continue for some more time because the war in Ukraine has not ended, and the US inflation data is not very supportive for sure. So, considering all this background, Anand, how are you crafting your strategy maybe for a next year, and what kind of capex allocation are you thinking of, or maybe you're not thinking of? So, how do you look at your finance strategy for the next FY?
I think, Amol, the sector in which I operate is more like an infra sector, while it does sound like retail, but definitely the assets that we build and the kind of setups that we create in terms of stores and warehouses or facilities, these are fairly long term. So typically 1 or 2 year downturn in interest cycles or setbacks really do not impact our long term capex planning. So from that perspective, irrespective of what the situation currently is, whether in terms of geopolitical situation or economy or interest cycles, I think we are fairly confident on the overall outlook for India as a consumption economy and retail as a sector for growth. And therefore, I think our pedal on investments remains where it was, if not pressed higher. So I think we will continue with what strategy we have been following of increasing growth, increasing investments to the extent possible, with a medium to long term return view, not immediate 1 or 2 year return view, but medium to long term return view.
Okay, sure. Anil?
I also have a similar view because what happens for us to build capacity, it takes longer time, and more so if it is air. Because to get an aircraft, it is more than a year cycle to add a cargo facility. In addition to that, to have a bigger, hubs and warehouses where the goods are handled. From that perspective, I think we need to continue with our investment in capacity building, and more so when long-term perspective of India, consumption story and growth story is going to be intact. Yes, there could be some, soft spots in between, but long-term story being good, keeping that in mind from investment point of view, we would keep adding capacity. We are in fact looking at currently because existing capacities have almost fully utilized, and then we are adding more capacity both in air and ground. Similarly, use of technology for better efficiency and productivity, and that is all becomes a focus for us because when you have a volume, you can't do manual work and manually sort them and do that. So from that perspective, I think to improve speed, the technology and automation would play a major role. Both the increase in capacity, physical capacity, as well as use of automation and digitalization would continue to get a higher share of investment from us.
Hmm. Sure. So Madhvi, my question to you is specifically on the now GDP front. So we have enough projections from the World Bank to IMF about India. The one good thing is everyone is very positive about India. So, one, to continue this positivity, what is the long-term view that the government should take? What kind of coordination that the government and the central bank should have in terms of the balanced policy? And again, if you could, if you allow me to add to this again, is we have been talking about a $5 trillion economy. Have you by any chance made a recent guess in terms of how far are we from that?
So obviously the 5 trillion number looks to be nominal number is not something that one you should look at in the first place, right? And for on the question that you asked as to what is the policy focus at this point in time to make us reach that 5 trillion path in the first place. Of course, when they had come out with the 5 trillion number, they did not expect a pandemic to take place, which obviously has eaten away close to 2% of global GDP in general. So you again, whatever is your time period in mind, be it 7 years, 8 years, or whatever it is, anyway, that has added further 2 years to that. Now again, it brings back to the same argument for me that what will drive that big, big lever of that 5 trillion or a sustainable growth story for India. Generally, India is seen as a consumption-driven economy, and that also has kept us supposedly resilient when the world was probably is going to slow down in the early part of this year or mid of this year. The hope is that India, being a domestic-driven economy, will at least be resilient for some time before catching up with the rest of the world. So I think beyond the near-term slower growth picture that we will see on absolute basis, which relatively may still look to be better, I think again the whole point sort of boils down to what next. So I think the coordination between exports and your private capex is something that they need to work on. Of course, public sector will have to play a very important role. They have been trying really hard to create an ecosystem which eventually will incentivize private sector to come and participate in the economy. But what is ailing at this point in time is a private consumption, which I think needs a push. We need a more productive employment creation in general in India. In fact, if I look back in the last 2 years or so, especially again, I'll focus on the rural sector because the kind of K-shaped recovery we have seen, rural is clearly lagging that of urban, which you can even get a sense from most of these FMCG companies commentaries as well. What has happened is that even though the rural sector and even urban sector, both of them have reached a higher employment level compared to what the pre-pandemic level was, the allocation of labor has actually been very inefficient. So what you've seen is that of the almost 2.8 million jobs that have been added in agriculture, in rural sector since the pandemic, on net basis, the allocation of job has been very, very, as I said, suboptimal. So agriculture has seen close to around, 7 million jobs addition, which essentially have come at the cost of, almost 7 million or so fall in the services employment, which is relatively a more productive, more efficient, and more income-driven sector. So in all, because the even despite the increase in labor employment, the shift of labor has been more towards a more disguised unemployment driven sector, which is agriculture. The overall income itself has come down. So the whole idea is to ensure that the consumption and if India again sort of sees an uptick on a sustainable basis, which again has to come from the productive capacity creation in India, not by increasing the current account deficit. So basically, your internal and external balances should manage. Even when you're trying to push consumption back home, which everybody wishes they do, it shouldn't be coming at the cost of a very high current account deficit, which basically means a very high import level. Because in the end, you need to fund your current account deficit by only raising debt from the foreign market, which is the capital account. And unfortunately, the so-called FX reserves that we had to the extent of 630 billion plus, which is now looking to be 550 billion kind of a number, are essentially being built on account of global liabilities that you have created, not the global assets that you have created back home. So when you are talking about policymakers giving a push by either a fiscal or a monetary coordination to improve the consumption spending in the country, it should come in line with productive capacity creation, which obviously, as I said, will require some push from the government end as well. And I think to some extent, the manufacturing ecosystem has to sort of get fast tracked. And either by extending or deepening the PLIs to exporters or promoting the Make in India, or even for the railway manufacturers, they can probably do some kind of a push to these sectors. And on apart from that, of course, aggressive asset sale, which sort of has been missing in the last 2 years, which could be in the form of existing public infra monetization, divestment, strategic sales, or functional infra monetization. All of it, have been lagging for the last 2 consecutive years as far as the targets are concerned. And I think uh, uh, more efficient allocation of these resources could also allow the fiscal deficit to come down, but also lead to a better fiscal impulse despite a lower fiscal deficit, which again will have a better fiscal multiplier and lead to a general improvement in public sector, private sector demand improvement. But all of these are more long drawn stories again. How you coordinate between investment, exports, domestic consumption, all of them together and not yet lead to any kind of external imbalance in the form of higher current account deficit is something that they need to play very carefully. Because if you try to push consumption way too hard, or even try to give incentives to certain segment, which probably could lead to a more overheating in the economy, you are going to pay a price by a higher current account deficit, which will lead to a pressure on your external sector account, or rupee, or even interest rates in general.
Sure. Quite notable overview here, and I'm sure the government has a tough time actually managing the budget this time. Thanks for that, Madhavi. There are a couple of questions. I think few of them we somehow took into our discussion, but this is an interesting question, and Kunal, I would like you to take it. This is about uh, what are the say sectors related to growth, or maybe new areas where the government should put more focus on, apart from the traditional sectors, like maybe, or segments like infrastructure and agriculture. So basically the question is more on the, are there any new sectors that you see, where the
No,
government
sure.
should
I think so. I get that. And it's a very, very pertinent question at this stage because these are changing times, as we all know. And we are changing, the world is changing, and obviously the whole outlook is changing as well. So, if you ask purely from a sector's perspective, let me start with a little micro example. Let me say lending has transformed a lot thanks to UPIs of the world, which have worked very well from a government push, and now it's actually going international as well. And probably over the years, it may see adoption by multiple countries as well. Government is actively promoting it. Now, this sector, essentially, this in itself will become a sector, although it emanates from lending. It's kind of more talking of a unified interconnected protocol for payments. It can be unified interconnected protocol for a lot of other things as well. So it's a green shoot that one is seeing, and I think so. A lot more investments can be attracted there. A push can be seen there, and therefore I am talking more about these kind of new innovations that are coming and seeing green shoots where government should definitely focus. And I see government allocating good amount over there as well. Having said that, as we all know, BFSI continues to be the leader, and BFSI continues to be one of the growth sectors that we will see because of larger adoption of obviously digitization and technology, the AI, and obviously the boost that has come thanks to digital for a larger geographical penetration as well. So that will continue to be on a much larger side. I believe technology will continue to have its importance, and although it may go a little bit up and down, but in the long run, it will attract lot of different areas, and each and every industry will attract it. Therefore, it will continue to have its own roadmap and a larger thing. I strongly believe, which I said earlier as well, that manufacturing should be given a disproportionate push. And it's high time that manufacturing takes off. But the nature of the industry is such, and like Anil said, that it actually requires a larger turnaround time to for the capex to even stabilize and start showing fruits as well. I believe it is any time that it will take push because there has been an initiatives that's constantly happening in those areas, which will essentially try and take things in a big manner.
Sure, Kunal, I think valid points. One more quick question here is specifically about the climate change. The government has already committed, the net zero target, and So in the coming budget, what is it that the government should do? Should they, should they, what kind of framework government should actually announce for the climate change kind of policy or something like that to achieve the target of CO2 or net carbon zero? So anyone would like to take this question? Anand, Anil,
So,
Madhav?
uh,
Yeah,
let me just put 2 points and probably then can
yeah.
take. I believe there is a lot happening on circular economy.
Hmm.
While government has also enacted some regulations and some
Hmm.
hard regulations as well, I
Hmm.
believe a much harder ones can be also implemented, which essentially makes corporates responsible to give back. Government can also attempt to introduce responsibilities at individual level through budgets, which will be something which requires a lot of deliberation as well. But that is something which will make sure that a responsibility at all level comes. Having said that, the move to electrification can just be expedited, which will make sure, because see, in 6.5 years is what is left essentially for the promise made by government.
Right.
Else the temperatures will also increase and it's going to create a lot of issues from an India perspective. So it looks little far-fetched also to not do something exorbitant and then let it just go a die, and therefore drastic measures will be required in this area as well. I don't know,
Sure.
Anand, Anil, you want to add something to this?
Yeah, Amol, I think on the climate change bit, I think there are two parts to this. So one is around having a framework of regulation on how to make this work, because just by stating that we want to reach carbon goals in X years is not going to take us there. The second part which the budget can definitely hope to achieve is through incentivization. So while a framework is a bigger piece and may not just be achieved only by announcing it in the budget, but I think what can definitely be achieved in the budget is to have certain amount of incentivization both at the corporate level and the industry level, and also at the individual level, to encourage people to be aware and be more responsible for reaching the net zero goals. So, for example, at the individual level, the budget can give more incentivization for buying electric vehicles or investing in sustainable packaging, etc. Similarly, on the industry front, there can be PLI schemes for companies which promote sustainable packaging or sustainable products, etc. And similarly, at the more at the corporate level, and I think which Kunal was also sort of hinting at, which is around the reporting requirements or the BRSR requirements, which have already been in place to a certain extent, voluntarily or otherwise. But I think they can be made more global, more stringent, and more target driven, rather than actually just as a statement of intent driven. So a combination of all these three can pave the way for a bigger framework, and framework cannot or will not happen in one budget. I think it is a process which will get evolved. But yes, definitely in the budget there should be some starting or initiation of this thought, so that this can take a more meaningful shape.
Sure. I think thanks for adding that, Anand. And I think we are just overshot, but let me take 1.5 minute and take a last question with all of you. Obviously, there are a couple of questions, but I think we partly discussed that, and maybe we'll take it later. But one last question to all of you is obviously, we have lots of expectations, in fact, dozens of them. But ideally, if we specifically speak about what should not be there in the budget, what is going to be your view, what you don't want to see in the budget. uh Madhavi, I will start with you.
A very populist budget, which is expansionary in nature.
Mhm. Okay, sure. Anand.
I have one very simple expectation: there should be no surprises in the fine print. That's all.
Sure. Anil.
If we see currently, there's a lot more complex burden to increase over a period of time. The last years, if we go back, and the burden has increased. So I think rather than increasing the burden, one should take away that burden so that ease of business starts happening. So I would say that there should not be any negative surprise, so to say, that further you increase the compliances. Yes, as long as they are in a automated form, or if there's a repository from there they can draw, I'm okay with that. But definitely not looking at in any compliance increase further.
Sure. And Kunal?
So anything that increases imports or kind of reduces exports should not be there.
Okay, sure. It's a great learning for me. Very interesting perspective from all of you. And let's hope the points that we discussed, the government officers looks at it and at least try to incorporate a few specifically in the budget. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts here at the etcfo.com and being with us for almost an hour. Thank you so much, Anand, Kunal, Anil, and Madhavi for sharing your thoughts. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Pleasure being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here.